comrades, workers and all who feel the quiet pressure of a world that demands your labor but denies your dignity. Listen carefully. The system, you are told, is eternal, trembles not at fists or fire, but at clarity. Empires do not fall because they are struck, they fall because they are seen. And once seen, once understood, they cannot be unseen. What you comprehend today becomes the force that ends tomorrow's illusions. You have been taught to believe that power lives only in palaces, parliaments, and boardrooms. You are told history is moved by great men, by markets, by destiny. This is the first lie of domination. Power, in truth, is born in the hands that build, in the minds that calculate, in the bodies that labor. The system survives by convincing those who create everything that they own nothing, not even their own understanding of the world they sustain. Capitalism presents itself as common sense. It tells you that poverty is failure, that wealth is virtue, that competition is nature. But these are not laws of the universe, they are habits of exploitation. What appears natural is merely familiar. What appears inevitable is merely organized. And what is organized by human hands can be reorganized by human will. Look closely at your daily life. You rise early, you sell your labor, you return exhausted. The product of your work leaves your hands and returns as a commodity you must purchase. You create abundance, yet live with scarcity. You produce wealth, yet experience insecurity. This contradiction is not an accident, it is the engine of the system. Capital does not grow by rewarding labor, it grows by extracting from it. Profit is unpaid work. Wealth is accumulated time stolen from the many and concentrated in the hands of the few. The system does not fear your anger alone. Anger can be redirected, commodified, turned against your neighbor. It fears your understanding. When workers grasp that exploitation is structural, not personal, when the oppressed see that their suffering is not a moral failure, but a social design, then the ground begins to shake. Consciousness is the real revolutionary force. The ruling class knows this well. That is why it fragments you. It divides worker from worker, native from migrant, employed from unemployed. It invents hierarchies of worth to prevent unity of interest. It sells identity without solidarity, freedom without material security, choice without power. It floods your mind with distractions while draining your body of energy. A divided class is a disciplined class, yet beneath these divisions lies a shared reality. Whether in factory or office, field or platform, you sell your labor to survive. You do not own the means by which society produces its life. That ownership, private, concentrated, and protected by law, is the root of domination. As long as production is organized for profit rather than need, human potential will be sacrificed at the altar of accumulation. Do not be deceived. Reforms that leave this foundation untouched are concessions, not liberation. Higher wages without power over production are temporary relief. Rights without economic control are fragile promises. Charity cannot replace justice. The system may soften its edges, but its core remains unchanged so long as labor is subordinated to capital. Understanding transforms fear into resolve. When you see that unemployment is a tool, not a failure, that debt is a leash, not a choice, that crisis is a feature, not a flaw, you cease to blame yourself. And when self-blame ends, solidarity begins. The worker who understands their position understands their strength. The entire system rests upon their continued cooperation. History is not the story of rulers, it is the record of class struggle. Every advance, every right, every dignity won was wrested from power by organized pressure. Nothing was gifted, nothing was accidental. The abolition of feudal bonds, the rise of industry, the formation of nations, all were shaped by material conditions and collective action. To understand history is to recognize your place within it, not as a spectator, but as an actor. The collapse of the system will not arrive as a sudden spectacle. It begins quietly in conversations, in study circles, in workplaces where workers ask not only how, but why. It grows when people connect their private hardships to public structures. It accelerates when organization replaces isolation, when strategy replaces spontaneity, when hope is grounded in analysis rather than wish. Do not wait for permission. Power never authorizes its own end. Do not wait for collapse to act. Collapse follows action. Build institutions of solidarity. Educate yourselves and one another. Claim control over your labor, your communities, your future. Replace competition with cooperation, profit with purpose, hierarchy with democracy rooted in material equality. The ruling class will tell you this is impossible. They have always said so, until it happened. They will warn of chaos, of scarcity, of human nature. Yet it is their system that produces chaos, their logic that creates scarcity amid abundance, their nature that demands domination. A society organized for human need is not utopian, it is rational. Comrades, the greatest weapon ever forged is not the machine, the army, or the law, it is understanding. Once the worker understands the system has already begun to lose, for a class that knows itself cannot be permanently ruled. The future does not belong to those who own today, but to those who comprehend tomorrow. Let us be clear-eyed. Let us be organized. Let us transform understanding into action, and action into a new world. The system does not collapse from attack. It collapses from understanding, and that understanding is already spreading. Capitalism survives not primarily through force, but through familiarity. It embeds itself so deeply into everyday life that it appears less like a historical system and more like the natural order of things. From childhood, individuals are taught to see competition as instinct, hierarchy as efficiency, and inequality as consequence rather than design. Work is framed as virtue, wealth as proof of merit, and poverty as personal failure. In this way, capitalism does not merely organize production, it organizes perception. It trains people to interpret social relations through the lens of the market, until imagining life beyond it feels naive, unrealistic, or dangerous. What is presented as human nature is in fact a social habit cultivated over centuries. Cooperation, mutual aid, and collective responsibility, traits that sustained societies long before industrial capitalism, are dismissed as idealistic, while selfishness and accumulation are elevated as biological facts. This ideological inversion allows capitalism to cloak itself in inevitability. If the system reflects nature itself, then resistance appears futile and alternatives appear childish. The system thus avoids constant coercion by persuading people that no other arrangement is possible, that history has reached its final form. The language of inevitability is reinforced by institutions that repeat the same assumptions under different guises. Economics textbooks treat markets as neutral mechanisms rather than power structures. Media narratives celebrate entrepreneurs while erasing the labor that enables their success. Political discourse narrows debate to what is realistic within capitalist limits, excluding systemic change before it can even be discussed. Even suffering is normalized. Economic crises are described as cycles, unemployment as adjustment, precarity as flexibility. What should provoke outrage is reframed as inconvenience. What should inspire resistance is reframed as patience. Capitalism also survives by fragmenting experience. Each worker encounters exploitation as an individual problem, low wages, long hours, debt, insecurity, rather than as a shared condition. This isolation prevents the recognition of common cause. When hardship is privatized, responsibility is internalized. Individuals blame themselves for structural failures, seeking self-improvement instead of collective solutions. The system benefits when people compete for survival rather than unite to change the conditions of survival itself. The appearance of inevitability is further strengthened by the constant invocation of collapse. Any challenge to capitalist organization is met with warnings of chaos, scarcity, and disorder. Socialized alternatives are portrayed as unnatural experiments doomed to fail, while capitalism's own failures are excused as temporary deviations. Hunger in a world of abundance, homelessness amid empty buildings, exhaustion alongside technological advancement, these contradictions are treated not as indictments of the system, but as unfortunate realities of life. The question is never why these contradictions exist, only how individuals should adapt to them. By monopolizing imagination, capitalism limits political possibility. People are encouraged to demand better outcomes within the system, not to question the system itself. Reforms are tolerated as long as they do not threaten the underlying relations of ownership and control. The idea that workers might collectively govern production or that society might prioritize need over profit is dismissed as unrealistic precisely because it challenges what has been declared natural. The greatest achievement of capitalism is not wealth accumulation, but the colonization of thought. Yet history itself contradicts inevitability. Capitalism emerged from specific material conditions, displacing feudal systems that once also claimed divine or natural authority. Those systems, too, appeared eternal until they were exposed as contingent and overthrown by changing social forces. What exists today is neither timeless nor fixed. It is maintained through laws, norms, and beliefs that can be altered. The system depends on continuous participation, continuous belief, continuous acceptance of its premises. The moment capitalism is recognized as a historical arrangement rather than a natural law, its authority weakens. When people understand that markets are designed, that property relations are enforced, that inequality is produced rather than deserved, the spell begins to break. What once felt unquestionable becomes debatable. What once felt inevitable becomes conditional. And when enough people see that the system is sustained not by destiny, but by their own constrained consent, capitalism's greatest defense, its invisibility, begins to erode. Exploitation under capitalism is not an exception, an abuse, or a moral deviation. It is the very structure upon which the system rests. Profit does not emerge from ingenuity alone, nor from exchange itself, but from a specific social relation between those who own the means of production and those who own only their labor power. The worker enters this relation formally free, legally equal, and apparently compensated, yet the equality ends the moment production begins. What appears as a fair wage conceals a deeper extraction, one that operates not through deception at the level of exchange, but through domination at the level of production. Labor power is sold like a commodity, but unlike other commodities, it produces more value than it costs to maintain. The worker is paid enough to survive, to reproduce their ability to work, but not enough to claim the full value they create. The difference between what the worker is paid and what their labor produces is surplus value, and this surplus is the source of profit. It is unpaid labor crystallized into wealth for the owner. This process does not require cruelty or corruption. It functions perfectly well under lawful contracts, moral language, and social approval. The working day is divided invisibly into two parts. In the first, the worker produces value equivalent to their wage. In the second, they continue to labor, but now entirely for the benefit of capital. This second portion is never acknowledged as theft, because it is normalized as productivity, efficiency, or dedication. The worker feels exhaustion, not exploitation. The system ensures that this extraction is perceived as natural, even necessary, because the alternative, owning the means of production, is structurally denied to the majority. Exploitation persists not because capitalists are uniquely malicious, but because competition compels them to extract surplus or be eliminated. Each firm UST maximize profit to survive, forcing longer hours, greater intensity, technological displacement, and wage suppression. Individual morality is irrelevant, the logic of capital overrides intention. Even those who benefit from the system are bound by its imperatives. Capital becomes an autonomous force, moving through people rather than being consciously directed by them. This structure produces alienation at every level. The worker is alienated from the product of their labor, which confronts them as an external power. They are alienated from the act of labor itself, which becomes a means of survival rather than an expression of human creativity. They are alienated from their fellow workers, transformed into competitors, and they are alienated from their own potential, reduced to a function within a machine whose purpose they do not control. Exploitation thus operates not only economically, but psychologically and socially, shaping how individuals understand themselves and one another. The accumulation of capital intensifies exploitation over time. As productivity increases, fewer workers are needed to produce the same output, creating a reserve army of labor, unemployed or precariously employed workers who discipline those still working. Fear replaces coercion. Wages stagnate despite rising productivity because workers are interchangeable while capital is mobile. The system requires insecurity to function efficiently, and it produces it relentlessly. Exploitation also extends beyond the workplace. Rent extracts income from those who must live somewhere. Debt captures future labor before it is even performed. Global supply chains transfer surplus from the periphery to the center, reproducing exploitation on an international scale. What appears as consumer choice in one region is built on super-exploited labor in another. The same logic governs all levels. Those without ownership must submit their labor to those with it. Attempts to address exploitation without confronting its structural roots inevitably fail. Higher wages, improved conditions, or ethical consumption can mitigate suffering but cannot abolish unpaid labor. As long as production is organized for profit, surplus extraction remains the system's driving force. Capital does not exist to meet human needs. Human needs are subordinated to capital's expansion. The system cannot be reformed into justice without dismantling the relations that generate profit itself. Understanding exploitation as structural shifts the focus from individual blame to collective action. It reveals that the problem is not greed, inefficiency, or corruption, but ownership and control. When workers recognize that their shared condition arises from the same relation, solidarity becomes rational rather than sentimental. The realization that profit is unpaid labor transforms resignation into clarity, and clarity into a recognition that the wealth of society is already produced by those who are denied power over it, sustained daily by millions whose labor exceeds their compensation, whose time is divided between survival and accumulation for others, whose exploitation is normalized through contracts, language, and law, whose collective force remains latent as long as the structure that extracts surplus from their labor remains intact. Division among workers is not an accidental byproduct of society, but a deliberate mechanism of control, refined over time to preserve the dominance of those who own wealth and power. A unified working class represents the greatest threat to ruling class authority, because unity exposes the shared material conditions that bind workers together regardless of culture, identity, or occupation. Division fractures this shared reality, transforming collective strength into scattered vulnerability. When workers are separated, they negotiate alone, struggle alone, and ultimately fail alone, while the system that exploits them remains intact and unchallenged. The ruling class understands that exploitation cannot be maintained indefinitely through force alone. Coercion is costly and unstable. Division, however, is efficient and self-sustaining. By encouraging workers to see one another as rivals rather than allies, The system redirects frustration horizontally instead of vertically. Anger that might otherwise target ownership, wages, and control is displaced onto fellow workers competing for jobs, housing, and survival. Scarcity is manufactured, then weaponized, so that workers fight over access rather than question why abundance is monopolized. This division takes many forms, each tailored to specific historical and social contexts. Race, nationality, religion, gender, and legal status are transformed into lines of separation, not because these differences inherently produce conflict, but because they can be used to obscure class relations. A worker is encouraged to believe their hardship is caused by another worker who looks different, speaks differently, or lives differently, rather than by the economic structure that exploits both. Prejudice becomes functional, not merely ideological, because it weakens solidarity and strengthens domination. The labour market itself is designed to enforce division. Workers are ranked, categorized and stratified, skilled versus unskilled, permanent versus temporary, formal versus informal. These distinctions create artificial hierarchies within the working class, fostering resentment and competition. Those slightly more secure are encouraged to fear falling downward rather than question why insecurity exists at all. The presence of unemployment and precarious labour acts as a constant threat, reminding workers that resistance can be punished by replacement. National borders serve a similar function on a global scale. Workers in different countries are pitted against one another through wage competition, while capital moves freely across borders in search of cheaper labour and higher returns. Instead of uniting against multinational exploitation, workers are encouraged to defend national economies that do not belong to them. Patriotism replaces class consciousness, and international solidarity is dismissed as unrealistic, even as capital itself operates internationally without restraint. Ideology reinforces division by framing inequality as deserved and difference as destiny. Meritocracy tells workers that success reflects effort, while failure reflects weakness. This narrative isolates individuals within their outcomes, discouraging collective interpretation of shared conditions. Media and political discourse amplify cultural conflicts while minimizing economic ones, creating the illusion that society's primary struggles are moral or symbolic rather than material. Workers are invited to choose sides in manufactured debates, while the structure of exploitation remains untouched. Even resistance movements are vulnerable to division when they lose sight of material foundations. When struggles become detached from economic relations, they can be absorbed into the system as symbolic victories that leave power unchanged. Representation without redistribution, inclusion without transformation, recognition without control, all can coexist comfortably with exploitation. The ruling class tolerates fragmented resistance because it poses no systemic threat. Division also operates psychologically. When workers internalize competition, they begin to police themselves and one another. Solidarity feels risky, trust feels naive, and collective action feels unrealistic. Isolation becomes normalized. People experience exploitation as personal stress rather than social injustice. This internalization is one of the most effective forms of control because it requires no external enforcement. The system persists because it is reproduced daily through beliefs, habits, and fears shaped by material conditions. The paradox is that division weakens everyone except those at the top. Lower wages, longer hours, reduced protections, and diminished bargaining power affect all workers, even those temporarily privileged within the hierarchy. Yet as long as divisions remain, these shared consequences are interpreted as individual misfortunes rather than collective outcomes. The ruling class relies on this misinterpretation to maintain stability, knowing that a divided working class cannot recognize its own power, cannot act in unison, and cannot challenge ownership of the means of production that governs their lives. determines their conditions, and shapes the limits of what they are encouraged to imagine as possible. Class consciousness is not an abstract idea or a moral awakening. It is a material realization born from lived experience under specific social conditions. It emerges when individuals who suffer in isolation begin to recognize that their suffering is shared, patterned, and produced by a common structure. The worker who understands their exploitation not as personal misfortune but as a collective condition takes the first step toward revolutionary awareness. This shift in understanding transforms scattered grievances into a unified perspective, and it is this unity of understanding that gives class consciousness its power. Under capitalism, everyday life is organized to prevent this realization. Workers encounter the system as individuals, individual contracts, individual wages, individual debts, individual failures. The system thrives on this fragmentation because it keeps exploitation invisible at the collective level. Class consciousness disrupts this illusion by revealing the social relations beneath daily experience. It exposes that wages are not rewards but costs of labor power, that unemployment is not accidental but functional, and that insecurity is not a flaw but a mechanism of discipline. What once appeared as isolated struggles are revealed as expressions of a single relation between labor and capital. This awareness does not arise automatically from hardship alone. Poverty, exhaustion, and inequality can persist for generations without producing revolutionary action if they are interpreted through the dominant ideology. C. Class consciousness develops through struggle, education, and organization. It grows when workers compare experiences, share analysis, and confront the contradictions of the system together. The act of organizing itself deepens consciousness, as collective action reveals both the limits imposed by capital and the latent power of solidarity. Class consciousness is revolutionary because it changes how power is understood. Instead of seeing power as something possessed exclusively by elites, workers begin to see it as something they collectively generate. Every factory, office, and service depends on their labor, continuing uninterrupted. Every profit depends on their compliance. When workers understand this dependency, obedience becomes a choice rather than a given. The recognition that the system relies on them more than they rely on it alters the balance of fear, replacing resignation with confidence grounded in material reality. This consciousness also dissolves artificial divisions. When class becomes the primary lens through which society is understood, differences of culture, identity, and nationality are recontextualized rather than erased. Workers recognize that while their experiences may differ in form, they are connected by the same exploitative relation. This does not deny specific oppressions, it situates them within a broader structure that benefits from fragmentation. Class consciousness does not flatten struggle, it connects it, creating the possibility of coordinated action rather than competing demands. The ruling class fears class consciousness precisely because it cannot be easily co-opted. Individual ambition can be absorbed into capitalism. Moral outrage can be redirected. Even rebellion can be commodified if it lacks structural understanding. Class consciousness resists these absorptions because it targets ownership, control, and production itself. It challenges not just outcomes, but the relations that produce them. It asks not for a fairer distribution within exploitation, but for the abolition of exploitation as a social principle. As class consciousness develops, political limits shift. What once seemed impossible becomes thinkable. Collective ownership, democratic control of production, and planning based on human need cease to appear utopian and begin to appear necessary. The future is no longer imagined as endless adaptation to crisis, but as transformation of the conditions that generate crisis. This is why class consciousness is inseparable from historical movement. It links present struggle to future possibility. Revolutionary force does not originate in spontaneous outrage, but in sustained understanding. Moments of crisis can ignite action, but without class consciousness, that action dissipates or is redirected. With class consciousness, even small struggles accumulate into momentum, as each confrontation reveals more clearly the nature of the system and the capacity of collective resistance. The working class becomes not merely a category within society, but a conscious subject capable of reshaping it. Class consciousness is the point at which history becomes self-aware. It is where the producers of social wealth recognize themselves as such and refuse to remain objects within a system they sustain. It transforms endurance into intention and reaction into strategy. It is not imposed from outside, but eloped from within struggle itself, growing stronger as workers test their power, learn from defeat, and refine their understanding of the forces arrayed against them and the collective strength they possess when they no longer see themselves as isolated individuals, but as a class acting in its own historical interest. Collective organization is not merely a tactic within struggle, it is the material form through which historical change becomes possible. Individual resistance, no matter how passionate or courageous, remains confined within the limits imposed by the system it confronts. Capitalism is organized, disciplined, and coordinated across institutions, markets, and states. To challenge a system of such scale and coherence requires a force equally structured, deliberate, and collective. Organization transforms dispersed discontent into social power, giving direction to anger and durability to resistance. The working class exists objectively as a condition, but it becomes a historical force only through organization. Without organization, workers experience exploitation as private hardship. With organization, those same experiences are interpreted as shared conditions produced by common structures. Collective organization provides the space where analysis replaces confusion, where solidarity replaces isolation, and where strategy replaces spontaneity. It is within organized struggle that individuals learn not only what they oppose, but what they are capable of building together. Capitalism relies on fragmentation to maintain control. Workers are separated by workplace, contract, identity, and geography, each negotiating from a position of weakness. Organization reverses this imbalance by consolidating power. When workers act together, the asymmetry between labor and capital begins to narrow. Collective bargaining, strikes, and coordinated action interrupt the flow of profit, revealing the system's dependence on labor's continued participation. Organization makes visible what the system works to conceal, that production halts without workers, that wealth ceases without cooperation. Organization is also a school of political development. Through participation in collective struggle, workers acquire skills that capitalism denies them: decision-making, leadership, coordination, and strategic thinking. These capacities are not abstract ideals, they are practiced realities developed through meetings, debates, and shared action. In this sense, organization prefigures the society it seeks to create, demonstrating in practice that people can govern themselves collectively without hierarchy imposed from above. The ruling class understands the danger of organized labor, which is why it seeks to suppress, co-opt, or bureaucratize it. Legal restrictions, repression, and institutional containment are used to limit the scope of organization to narrow demands that do not threaten underlying relations of ownership. Yet, even constrained forms of organization contain the potential for expansion because they bring workers together around shared interests and expose the limits of reform within capitalist structures. Each collective victory raises new questions about why such power must be exercised defensively rather than constructively. Systemic transformation requires more than episodic resistance. It requires sustained organization capable of enduring beyond moments of crisis. Capitalism survives by absorbing shocks, waiting for movements to exhaust themselves. Organization counters this by providing continuity, memory, and accumulation of experience. Lessons learned in one struggle inform the next. Defeats become sources of analysis rather than despair. Through organization, struggle becomes a process rather than an event. Collective organization also enables the articulation of alternative social arrangements. It is not enough to resist exploitation. A transformative movement must also envision and practice different forms of production and distribution. Cooperatives, councils, unions, and assemblies offer glimpses of how society might function when organized around human need rather than profit. These are not isolated experiments, but components of a broader process through which workers assert control over their conditions of life. Internationally, organization is essential to confronting capital's global reach. Capital coordinates across borders to exploit differences in wages, regulations, and labor protections. Without international solidarity, workers are forced into competition with one another, undermining gains achieved in any single location. Collective organization provides the framework through which workers can recognize shared interests across national boundaries and coordinate resistance against transnational exploitation. Systemic transformation is not the result of sudden collapse or singular acts of heroism. It emerges from the steady construction of collective power capable of challenging existing relations and instituting new ones. Organization turns necessity into agency, enabling workers to move from reaction to initiative. It is through organization that demands evolve into programs, protests into institutions, and resistance into governance. Without collective organization, the system absorbs opposition and reproduces itself. With it, the foundations of that system are confronted by a force capable of dismantling them and replacing them with social relations rooted in democratic control, shared ownership, and collective decision-making over the conditions of production and life itself, sustained by the conscious participation of those whose labor has always made society possible, and who now recognize their ability to organize that society according to their own needs and interests, rather than the imperatives of accumulation and domination that have defined their existence for generations and continue to shape the limits imposed upon them through every institution that governs work, survival, and social possibility. The system has endured not because it is just, efficient, or eternal, but because it has convinced generations to mistake habit for truth and submission for necessity. Once its mechanisms are understood, once exploitation is recognized as structural, division as deliberate, and power as collective, the illusion that sustains it begins to dissolve. What stands before us is not a natural order, but a human construction maintained by human labor and human consent. When that consent is withdrawn consciously and collectively, the foundations of domination crack. Understanding awakens class consciousness. Class consciousness demands organization, and organization transforms society itself. The future belongs not to those who own the present, but to those who comprehend its contradictions and act together to overcome them, turning knowledge into force, solidarity into power, and history into a project shaped by the many rather than ruled by the few.